Hey guys, I'm back with the lecture I promised you guys on imperialism in Asia. So, yesterday we talked about the white man's burden and what imperialism looked like in Africa. However, one thing I wanted to talk about was the imperialism of Asia. When I say Asia, that does also mean large parts of the Middle East and India as well. And you guys probably remember that Asia already had been colonized largely by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, and the Spanish as well in the Philippines, um, way back during the age of exploration. But fast forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and things have changed. So take a look at this map. Here is Great Britain and Burma. Now they are officially British colonies. Remember, in the early stages, Britain was not officially a colony. It was actually under the influence and control of the British East Asia Company, which is a corporation. So it wasn't officially considered, the an actual British colony under the control of the British monarch. The British had also fought France for influence as well, but it was again under the influence and control of the British East India Company, who had used what were called sepoys. These are Indian troops. Sepoy is Sepoy. A sepoy is an Indian soldier who works for the British government, who is sort of as a mercenary. You've got French Indochina in the area that is now Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. You have Siam, which is now today known as Thailand, which was independent, as well as much of China. But don't think that China is truly independent at this point. While China was not technically anybody's colony at this time, it did get divided into what are called spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is like when European countries sort of divide China up and call dibs on trading rights in those different parts of China. You look at Japan too. Japan is actually independent because it has become a westernized power. Under the influence of the United States and Britain, Japan learned very quickly how to modernize in order to avoid being colonized. You've got Indonesia, which are still called, and Singapore, which are still called at this point the Dutch East Indies. They're the Spice Islands. The Dutch had held onto them ever since the very early days of the age of exploration. Portugal has held on to one teeny tiny port in India called Goa. And the United States now, take a look, has a colony in Asia as well. It's the Philippines. The Philippines went from being a Spanish colony to being an American colony almost overnight. So let's get started and talk a little bit about what happens in Asia. So let's go back to India. Remember, I said that the British East India Company had been a private controller of India, and in 1876, because of an event called the Sepoy Rebellion, which I'm going to get into in just a sec, India became an official imperial colony by 1876. Russia also has expanded into Asia. This is sort of to be expected at this point because so much of Russia is actually in the Asian continent itself. So it was sort of just seen as Russia's traditional expansionism that had been going on ever since the 18th century. And this growth comes at the expense of the Ottoman Empire as they expand into what is now the Middle East. Also, this expansion stops, at least temporarily, in 1905 because of the defeat by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, which I talked about in the 1905 Russian Revolution lecture. Okay, but let's focus on China, though. China is a really important country. Even today, thank you. Even today, China continues to be at the center of the world's economy. Much of what we own is made in China. It wasn't always this way. The story of how China became what it is really starts here. So prior to European contact, you guys probably already know this, but China had been a powerful empire and with a very sophisticated system of government. They had traded with Europeans for a long time, starting with Marco Polo and the earliest explorers. But something happens in the early to mid 1800s called the Opium Wars, which is going to be a massive turning point for the history of China itself. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so going back to this, the trade between China and Britain. China had always had what's called a favorable balance of trade with Europe. That when I say favorable balance of trade, it really means that China had always had the upper hand in trade. Why? Well, because think about all the cool stuff China had: porcelain, spices, silk, tea. Um, Europeans were absolutely mad about everything that was made in China. Europeans loved Chinese tea, Chinese porcelain. These things became luxuries, and then they eventually became necessities to Europeans. The spices and the silks that came from China were very hot commodities in Europe. On the other side, China was very much not interested in any European goods. They really didn't feel the need to buy anything that was made in British or German factories. They also just did not industrialize. The only thing they were really interested in was the gold and silver that the British and other European countries were willing to pay for these Chinese goods. So, as a result, silver flows out of the European economy and into Chinese hands. That's why I say it was favorable, okay, because of all these goods. My kids are back. They want to say hi. There they are.
China.
Please stop. Okay. Sorry. It's working from home is, I miss the classroom, let me just say. Okay, so anyway, in the late 1700s, though, the balance starts to tip against China. For one, China starts to go through some internal problems having to do with their own government. Also, they don't participate in the Industrial Revolution. This is a huge deal. Also, it's ironic, right? Considering that today everything is made in China. China is full of factories. It's as a result, it's very polluted. It's got a massive industrial working class. It has experimented in its own way, let's just say, with communism and socialism and Marxist ideas because of that. So at the time, that's recent though, right? But in the 1800s, China didn't industrialize because they looked at what Britain was doing, and what they looked at, they saw what had become of the British environment as a result of industrialization, the poverty, the pollution, and they wanted none of that. So when the opportunity came to industrialize, they said thanks, but no thanks. We like the way we are, and they struggled to keep outsiders out. They didn't really want outsiders coming in and changing their civilization. Okay, but something happens. First, which is called the Opium Wars. Now, if you guys know, opium is a drug. It comes from the poppy flower. These are grown in abundance in places like Afghanistan and India. The pure opium comes from the poppy flower, and it can be used to make other drugs like heroin. This is a very addictive drug. It is known for its sort of euphoric feeling. It's also used as a painkiller. And there had been opium already available in Asia, but it was considered a luxury item for only the most elite of Asian society and was used, I don't want to say completely sparingly, but it was not an epidemic addiction. However, the British come up with a plan. In this way, I sometimes tell my students that the British government is kind of like the first ever drug cartel or drug dealers, I guess you could say. This is not the only time that a government has ever introduced drugs to a society, but this was incredibly effective. So the British, they start to trade opium for Chinese tea. At first, the Chinese said no, but opium had a fairly high street value. And the British had tons of opium because it was grown in India, which was also one of their colonies. They start to trade opium in abundant quantities for very cheap. As you can imagine, this causes an epidemic of opium addiction to take over China. And opium went from being a luxury for the elite to a street drug used by all classes of society in China nearly overnight. Now, think about what happens to a person, to an individual when they're addicted to drugs. Okay. Their sense of morals may go out the window. They will spend all their money, every last cent they have, on the drug. They become alienated from their family and their friends. They get into all kinds of legal trouble. Okay, now take that and apply it to a whole country. Think about what this did to Chinese society, especially considering the fact that the family unit is so central to Chinese society itself. The Chinese became addicted to opium at all levels of society. It didn't matter if you were rich or middle class or poor in China. Everybody was subjected to this epidemic of addiction. So they start to pay for the opium now in silver. And as a result, silver starts to flow out of China and into British hands like water. What's interesting to note here, and there's a reading on a primary source in your textbook, is that the British absolutely knew about the addictive qualities of opium. And for that same reason, opium was actually illegal in Britain because it was known to be a harmful drug. So the Emperor of China himself even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria saying, hey, why are you doing this? You need to stop bringing this opium into our community. You don't allow it into your community because you know how harmful it is. So I know what your game is here. As far as we know, Queen Victoria largely ignored that letter if she ever even read it at all. But that letter's in your textbook. So to combat this, the Chinese wage a war on the drug itself. This is really the first ever war on drugs. You guys might be familiar with that term. In America, we have done the same thing. It started in the 70s under President Nixon when he says we're going to wage a war on drugs, on drug addiction. We're going to get drugs off the street. We're going to punish drug dealers. Well, the Chinese government did the same thing. And they took extreme measures too. The Chinese government began to persecute drug dealers, even with the death penalty. They outlawed opium, but it didn't stop the British from trafficking it into the country. We have that same issue today, right? We are in America, drugs are illegal, drugs like cocaine and heroin, but it doesn't stop them from coming into the country. Somehow they find a way in via various avenues. The Chinese demanded that the British stop the opium trade, but Britain refused on the grounds that the demand for opium remained high. So, here's a picture, by the way, of an opium den. By the way, during this time, also many Chinese immigrants came to America and settled in San Francisco and opened up some opium dens in the streets of San Francisco as well, which I believe is where this picture was taken. But notice also these are men who are in the opium dens. Women also used opium. People can die of overdoses of opium. It turns people into lethargic, sort of, it makes people just kind of lay around and seem a little bit lazy or dazed and confused. It's used as, like I said, a painkiller, but it is so addictive that people did die and spend all their money, and they went on to steal. It causes gang wars. All of the problems we associate with drug addiction, this is what existed in China in the 1840s. So here's a picture of the Opium War itself. Now you can see in this picture, it's a Chinese ship, which looks a little bit old-fashioned, up against these British military ships in the background. Well, remember how I said that the Chinese never industrialized? That's important, because when the Opium War happens, the Chinese are still fighting with their old-fashioned ships. And the British, they've got these new industrial weapons and new guns on their ships. So when the wars break out, and they're called the Opium Wars because it was a series of smaller wars kind of all put together as one, the Chinese warships attacked the British cargo ships off the coast of China. And this officially starts the Opium Wars. The British were not having that, and they attack back. This goes on for about 2 years, but during those 2 years, the Chinese were easily defeated by the British, and opium continued to flow into the country. The old Chinese ships were no match for the new industrial strength British warships. So as a result, after every war, there's a treaty. And the person who gets to write the treaty is the winner. So the British write up the treaty that the Chinese are forced to sign. And this is called the famous Treaty of Nanjing. And the Treaty of Nanjing is what turns China around practically on its head, and it will seal China's fate forever. It has all these stipulations. One of them is that China had to pay what's called an indemnity to Britain for damages. Indemnity is another way of saying you break it, you buy it. So they had to actually pay for all of the British goods and ships that were damaged in the war. This amounted to a ridiculous sum of money that China simply didn't have. It would break China's economy. They also had to give up the island of Hong Kong to Britain. Why Hong Kong? Because it's an island off the coast. It's perfect for trade. It's full of ports. Now, if you've ever traveled to China or know anything about China at all, you know that Hong Kong is now part of China again. Hong Kong was returned to China back in 1997. However, Hong Kong and China culturally have a lot of differences because of the fact that Hong Kong was part of the British Empire for so long. For example, in Hong Kong, their money still has a picture of the Queen on it. In Hong Kong, capitalism is the way of life there. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, it's capitalism on speed. Like it's just full of businesses, and it's definitely not the same thing as the rest of mainland China. In fact, people who live in Hong Kong consider themselves to be Hong Kong citizens, and rather than being typically traditionally Chinese. You've probably seen on the news recently in this past year about the protests in Hong Kong, that the people of Hong Kong have protested against the oppressive measures of the Chinese government to censor them. That is because the people of Hong Kong traditionally just have different political values, I guess you could say, than the mainland Chinese government. China also had to open up 5 new ports for foreign trade to essentially allow foreigners to come in and trade. And with that, the British citizens that came to China to live there, many British actually immigrated there for business reasons. The Chinese government had to allow them to have what is called extraterritoriality. That's a big word. Essentially, what it means is they could live in China under British laws. So a British person could live in China and they didn't have to obey any Chinese laws. They only had to follow British laws. If they were accused of a crime, they would be tried in a British court, not a Chinese court. So as you can imagine, this meant that people didn't have any respect for Chinese laws when they were foreigners. Imagine what that would be like here, right? If anybody could come in whenever they felt like it and didn't have to even follow our laws. Well, the Chinese didn't like that very much. So this treaty essentially leaves China weak and vulnerable to more imperialist domination. Essentially, what the Treaty of Nanjing does is it opens the floodgates and it allows everyone to come into China. And this also causes competition amongst European powers. European powers were competing with each other now to have the best trade with China. But China completely lost control of its economy and even of its immigration. Here's a cartoon that explains a little bit about that. Take a look at this one and see if you can identify some of these key players. Sorry, allergies again. Okay, you might notice, by the way, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. This is China. This is a French cartoon. This is why China is spelled in French here, Sheen. Here's Queen Victoria of England. And this guy right here, who do you think he is based on his helmet? Isn't the German Kaiser? Based on his hat and his facial hair, this is the Tsar of Russia. This is Marianne. She represents the French Republic. Now notice, she's sort of in the back here. France doesn't actually get too involved in China. France had its own colonies in Asia called French Indochina, which are now known as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And now look at this guy right here. This is the guy next to Russia. This is Japan. So remember, Japan is modernized. They are going to avoid becoming colonized by modernizing. Remember, if you can't beat them, you join them. So that's what Japan does, and they do it very well. Even Japan is looking for a slice of the Chinese pizza. Meanwhile, the Chinese character back here, which this, by the way, is a very racist caricature drawing of the Chinese emperor, he just kind of has his hands up, and he is helpless to do anything about the fact that his country is being cut up without his consent. Very similar theme to what we see happen in Africa as well. So here you have an idea of what Asia finally looks like by 1914. And notice that China, again, is independent, but certain areas of it, key areas for trade, are under the heavy influence of various European powers. Even Australia is in this map. Remember, Australia is part of the British Commonwealth. India also is part of the British, is the brightest jewel in the British crown, and even Afghanistan and Tibet are under British influence. You've got the Philippines again under American influence, and here is the French Indochina. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about Japan, since I keep referring to them. Japan and Korea are an interesting story because, in the 20th century, we're going to see them take very surprising roles in world events, in particular in World War II and in the Korean War and the division of Korea. The ball sort of starts rolling here. Commodore Matthew Perry, that's not the same as the guy who plays plays Chandler on Friends, but his name was Commodore Matthew Perry. He was a leader of the American Navy, and he arrives in Tokyo Bay in 1853 to 1854, and he says essentially to the Japanese shogun, hey, knock, knock, we're here to trade, and you're going to do it on our terms, and if you don't, what's happening to China right now is going to happen to you next, so you all better fall in line and do what we say. It was a very bullying tactic, and it worked. Japan opened the doors and said, come on in, we're happy to trade with the United States on your terms. And so they dealt with these unfair trade treaties for a while, not just with the United States, but also with Britain and France and Germany, and the Dutch as well. Now remember, Japan had allowed some trade very early on in the age of exploration in the 1600s, but remember they had expelled the Catholic missionaries and had only allowed the Dutch to trade at one little island prior to this. So now the Japanese are forced to open up again. So Japan goes through this period of modernization. It's a 44-year-long period called the Meiji Restoration. Meiji means modern. And the new shogun who takes over, he is young. He's only, I think, 15 or 16 years old. And he sees the wave of the future. And he says, well, this is it, guys. This is it, Japan. We have to modernize. Japan did what Britain did, modernized and industrialized, and essentially copies America's modernization as well. They even put down their samurai swords and they pick up American-style guns to modernize their military. The difference, though, is that they did it in 44 years. So they did in 44 years what it took America and Britain to do in almost 100. So they do it really quickly. As a result, Japan emerges as a major world power, and they take over Korea. They tried to actually wipe out the Korean language and the Korean religion and Korean customs in order to try to force them to be Japanese. This causes a massive war, of course, between Korea and Japan. Later in World War II, Japan will invade Korea again, and this will eventually lead to the Korean War that will result in the division of Korea into North and South that we still have today. In Southeast Asia, the British and the French controlled various parts of Southeast Asia. This results in a rivalry between Britain and France. So the French take what is Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Later, after World War II, as you guys know, Vietnam will go through a communist revolution during the process of decolonization. France will try to calm it down for a while until they finally give up and decide to leave. And that's when America steps into our famous Vietnam War. And then again, I think I referred to this in one of the previous lectures, even the United States gets involved in this. This is when we talked about the white man's burden in the Spanish-American War in 1898, when America goes to war with Spain on the pretense of liberating Cuba from Spain. But in the process of doing that, we destroyed the Spanish fleet that was stationed in the Philippines, and then we took over the Philippines, and we paid Spain cash money for the Philippines. The Filipinos were not happy about this. later in World War II, the Philippines will also be invaded by Japan, and the United States will have to fight to liberate it. And then after that, we'll simply decolonize the Philippines. So you guys can see how this is, uh, you know, a process that is still playing out today. Imperialism is really one of those things that's not history at all. It is a continuing process. The effects of colonization and decolonization are still being felt, and imperial people and colonized people have different reactions to this. For example, in Africa, the Europeans brought in European style education, and some Africans were actually educated in the Western style. Well, what do you think they were learning in these Western schools? Enlightenment principles about self government and sovereignty. So many of them actually start to resent these European powers, and even some of these bourgeois Africans who are educated in the Western style, they really develop a hatred of colonial rule. This leads to African nationalism, different political parties and movements that will fight to free Africa from colonial rule. Africa will not become decolonized at all until after World War II. In China, we see the failed Boxer Rebellion happen. So, what happened in China, the Boxer Rebellion, after the Treaty of Nanjing, when so many foreigners were living in China, some Chinese nationalists, they were the righteous, harmonious fists. That's what they called themselves. They were mostly like fighters, warriors, who fought mostly in the style of martial arts. However, Europeans had never seen kung fu or martial arts before, so they didn't know what to call them. So they called them boxers because they figured like, oh, that looks kind of like boxing, I guess. So this event has been termed the Boxer Rebellion. But at one point, thanks, Cyrus. At one point, the righteous harmonious fists, as they call themselves, or boxers as they were called by the Europeans, they started to attack Western settlements and villages in the night. Like, we're talking literal ninjas here, guys, actually attacking these Western European and American villages. And it took an international effort. The British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, even Indian soldiers in the service of the British Crown, and the Japanese. They fought to crush the Boxer Rebellion, and effectively they did. So the Chinese then responded in a different way politically. They turned to a leader called Sun Yat-sen, who begins to promise an independent republic of China. And so in about 1912, the final Manchu dynasty falls, and we start to see the establishment of the Republic of China. From there, they will very quickly fall into a civil war, and one of the sides of the civil war will be the Communist Party after World War I, and this will continue and be interrupted by the Japanese invasion during World War II. So China has been through it, you guys. China's history is absolutely fascinating. So if you ever get a chance to study this in World or AP World, I highly recommend it. How does the United States respond to this? Well, the United States had responded to this by trying to stop European powers, you guys, by trying to stop European powers from going to war over China. So Europe had been planning on just each of them cutting a piece of China for themselves and claiming it as their own. In this political cartoon, you can see in the very middle of this map is Uncle Sam representing the United States. And the United States came up with a different plan. Why should we fight over China when we can just have an open door policy? So you see all the European powers with their scissors ready to cut up this map. And here comes Uncle Sam, and he's standing in the middle of it, preventing the cutting up from happening. And he's holding a trade treaty with China. And America's plan was basically, hey, let's not fight. Let's not claim any piece of China. Let's just open China up wide open. Everybody can trade with China however they want, and this free trade will prevent war and be profitable for all Western powers. So that's what happened. They all kind of went along with that plan. And the US open door policy was really America's first real foray into Asian foreign policy. Did this policy help China or did it hurt it? On the one hand, it did prevent a bloody war from happening in China, that would involve all European powers. On the other hand, China lost whatever little control they had over their immigration and economy. And this essentially causes China to have virtually no say in its economy or in who gets to live in China, who gets to come live in China at all. China had been such a secretive, isolated society for so long that this was certainly a shock to their system. So, and here, of course, we see, here's a little painting from your textbook. This is Japan's attempt to modernize, and they start to absorb a lot of Western methods. You can see like the Western style architecture and houses in the background. Let me go back here about the Japanese response, of course, is to simply Westernize and try to mimic their attackers rather than fight them off. This is known as the Meiji era under the Emperor Mutsuhito, who was young. He westernizes the military, the industry. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. My dog has something to say about that. But that's what it's about, if you guys want to watch that for your extra credit. India's response, by the way, India being the jewel in the crown. There was an event that actually caused India to go from being under the influence of the British East India Company to now officially being a British colony. This event is known as the Sepoy Rebellion, spelled out here. So remember, Sepoys are Indian soldiers in the service of the British Crown. They wear British uniforms. Many of them are Hindu, or most of them are Hindu, I should say. Remember, India is both, at this point, Hindu and Muslim. And Hindus and Muslims often don't get along in India. To say that, that's an understatement, I think. So the Sepoy Rebellion was an event that took place also in the mid-1800s, around the same time as everything else is going on here. What happened was that many Sepoys had become already angry at British officers for what were seen and perceived as, hey guys, hey, please, what were seen as oppressive measures. The British had also come in, British East India Company had come in and changed some laws that were seen as insulting to traditional Indian customs. And this was sort of the final straw. So they were in a training exercise under the command of some British troops, the Sepoys, right? They're in a training exercise. And they are training with their rifles. Now, back in those days, you had to open up your rifle cartridge with your teeth. It was a paper package and you had to tear it open with your teeth. Well, there were rumors going around, and I don't know how true these rumors were, but this is what Sepoys believed, that the packages were sealed. The rifle cartridges, which contained the gunpowder and ammo, were sealed with animal fat. It was cow fat or it was pig fat. But either way, this goes against the religion of the Hindus and Muslims. Hindus are forbidden to eat beef or cow flesh, whereas Muslims are forbidden to eat any pig meat or pig consumption at all. So whether it was pork fat or cow fat, it offended both the Hindu and the Muslim Sepoys. So during this training exercise, the Sepoys refused to open their cartridges, and they were charged with insubordination. Many of them were thrown in prison, and this led to a rebellion where the Sepoys turned on the British officers. And in retaliation, the British officers punished many of these Sepoys. Some died, some were thrown in prison, but it was seen as a massive injustice. So in an act of retaliation, a group of Sepoys attacked some British settlements in India, and they killed many British citizens, including some women and children. In retaliation to that, the British Army went into Indian villages and burned them down and killed hundreds and hundreds of innocent Indian civilians. So after that, word got back to the Queen of England at the time, Queen Victoria, and she said, "Oh my gosh, this has become such a mess. What do we do? The only way to control this is to bring it officially under my control." And so this is the event that caused India to be brought under the official control of the British government. Now, the British government did bring some peace, but there was still a lot of resentment. They brought some honest government, but the Indians still felt oppressed and were treated like second class citizens. The British also brought technology, like trains, which are still used in India today, were built by the British government. They also brought British schools. So Indian children went to school and learned English. As a result, most of India speaks English today anyway, and Western style education. But they're learning Enlightenment principles and ideas about laissez faire and capitalism and democracy. So, of course, this will lead to the movement for freedom in India and self government. So, the price of British rule, though, was that the majority of Indian people lived in extreme poverty. You know, some upper class Indian citizens, they were certainly fortunate enough to be on the right side of the British trade, but for everyone else, this meant extreme poverty, which India is still dealing with today. By 1883, we start to see the growth of Indian nationalism. A political party called the Indian National Congress is formed, which their agenda is to gain independence and sovereignty for India. India will not become free until after World War II, largely with the help of a leader named Mohandas Gandhi. Okay, so that's it for my imperialism in Asia. That went on a little bit longer than I planned. Sorry, guys. I hope you're still listening. Thanks for sticking with me. Anyway, I will be uploading some World War I stuff, and I hope that you guys can use the resources available to you in order to.
Bye.
See you later. I hope you guys can use the resources available to you, especially in the reading packet, to take a look at some of these documents that we talked about, including the letter from the Emperor to Queen Victoria. On that note, guys, I think I gotta go. The natives are getting restless, so I'll see you guys later. Bye.